The Korean People's Air Force has approximately 40 MiG-29 airframes in its operational inventory. The pilots who fly them receive an estimated 15 to 25 flight hours per year, a number so low that by the standards of any modern Air Force, the term proficiency requires qualification before use. A U.S. Navy pilot accumulates that many hours in a single month of carrier operations. The training gap between a KPAF MiG-29 pilot and any NATO standard aviator who might encounter him is the widest such gap in any current operational theater. It is so wide, in fact, that KPAF doctrine does not rely on individual pilot performance. It relies on numbers, on scripted scenarios, and on the institutional inertia of a military culture that has not engaged in air combat since the armistice of 1953. All of this context is available to any F-35B pilot scrambled from USS America in the Yellow Sea. It does not help with the specific problem that presented itself at 2:44 a.m. on a Tuesday in January, because the specific problem was not one that the KPAF's numbers, its scripted scenarios, or its institutional culture fully explained. The problem was a single MiG-29 that crossed the northern limit line with its radar off, its transponder dark, no afterburner, no radio transmission, and no formation context. That is not how KPAF pilots conduct provocations. Provocations are loud, radar on, transponder squawking, aggressive closure profile, the institutional performance of a military making a point. A single MiG-29 crossing the NLL in electronic silence at cruise power, descending slightly, maintaining its heading into South Korean airspace with the quiet consistency of a pilot who knows exactly where he is going. That did not fit the provocation template. It did not fit the strike template either. A strike would be fast, low, on a direct bearing toward a specific target. This aircraft was at 14,000 feet. Speed, 340 knots. Heading, 192 degrees. The heading of 192 degrees, projected forward, passed over the Yellow Sea without intersecting any military installation, any population center, or any target of tactical significance on the South Korean peninsula. The heading of 192 degrees, projected forward far enough, intersected USS America's approximate operating area. The Hawkeye had been tracking the contact since 2:41 a.m., 3 minutes before the NLL crossing, when it first appeared on the APS-145 radar as a fighter-sized return climbing from a field in North Hwanghae Province. The contacts from that field were usually MiG-21s in training patterns that stayed well north of the boundary. This contact had climbed to 14,000 feet, leveled, turned to heading 192, and maintained that heading with the precision of a pilot who had set an autopilot or a very clear intention. At 2:44 a.m., it crossed the line. The scramble order reached the lead at 2:44 a.m. and 31 seconds. Alert. 5 engines at idle power. Pilot strapped in the cockpit of an F-35B on the aft deck of USS America. The Yellow Sea, cold and dark below the overcast at 2,000 feet. The F-35B's short takeoff launch required 32 seconds from throttle advance to wheels leaving the deck. At 2:45 a.m. and 3 seconds, the aircraft was airborne. The ROE card in the lead's flight suit pocket, worn smooth from the dozens of times it had been reviewed and re-reviewed during the alert cycle, contained the authorization hierarchy for exactly this scenario. Unidentified contact crossing the NLL, intercept and identify. Determine intent. If confirmed hostile act, defined as weapons employment, fire control radar lock on a friendly asset, or aggressive maneuvering consistent with an imminent attack profile, weapons free. If intent cannot be confirmed as hostile, do not employ. Continue observation. Request updated authorization. The word that made the ROE card complicated was not hostile. It was imminent. The contact was at 14,000 feet, heading 192, 340 knots.
It was inside South Korean airspace. It was not radiating on any frequency. It had not activated its Topaz N019 radar. It was not an afterburner. It was not descending toward a target. It was flying south at cruise power in a posture that was inconsistent with both a military provocation and a military strike. The ROE card's definition of hostile act did not encompass what the contact was doing. It encompassed what the contact might do. The gap between those two things was the geometry problem that the lead had 21 minutes to resolve before the contact reached the point at which any subsequent decision would be reactive rather than deliberate. 21 minutes from the NLL crossing to the contact's projected position over the center of the Yellow Sea. At that position, the contact would either turn, descend toward the carrier group, or do something that resolved the ambiguity. Or it would continue on heading 192 over the Yellow Sea toward nothing in particular, which would not resolve the ambiguity at all. The F-35B climbed through 8,000 feet, NVG picture showing the overcast layer below and star-clear sky above, bearing 015 on the contact, now 68 nautical miles to the north. The APG-81 in passive mode, EW suite listening. The contact was still electronically silent. No radar, no transponder, no radio. The Hawkeye was maintaining track on the radar cross-section alone. A fighter-sized return at 14,000 feet, heading unchanged, speed unchanged. At 2:49 a.m., the lead reached 28,000 feet and turned to a closing vector. The geometry was straightforward in its mechanics and complicated in its implications. Close to visual identification range, assess the contact's configuration and behavior, determine intent from what could be observed rather than what could be electronically confirmed. Visual identification at night against a non-emitting contact with no lighting signature required the DAS infrared imaging system and the EOTS targeting pod. At the range where those systems could resolve airframe configuration and weapons loadout, the lead would be within 3 nautical miles of a MiG-29, whose pilot intentions were unknown. The DAS picture began resolving contact geometry at 2:52 a.m., range 14 nautical miles. Insufficient resolution at this range for configuration detail. The EOTS targeting pod, slewed to the contact's bearing by the APG-81's passive track, was producing a thermal image that showed a twin-engine aircraft at 14,000 feet, straight and level, speed unchanged at 338 knots. The engine plumes were visible in the IR. Military power on both AL-31F engines, not afterburner. The power setting of a pilot not in a hurry and not planning to be in a hurry. At 2:53 a.m., the first detail that changed the picture. The contact was not maintaining altitude with the precision of an autopilot. It was descending, not steeply, not rapidly. A descent rate of approximately 200 feet per minute, barely perceptible on the radar altimeter picture, a rate consistent with a pilot hand-flying an aircraft with a specific altitude objective. At 200 feet per minute from 14,000 feet, the pilot was aiming for approximately 12,000 feet above sea level. Not a strike altitude, not a low-level ingress altitude. Approximately the altitude at which a pilot making a visual approach to a naval vessel might establish himself for an initial recognition pass. The geometry that detail introduced was not clarifying. It was deepening the ambiguity in a different direction. A pilot descending toward an altitude appropriate for a visual approach to a naval vessel could be a pilot planning to request an emergency landing. Could be a pilot who had lost confidence in his navigation and was descending to better observe the sea surface for reference. Could be a pilot who had been given a specific intercept altitude for a meeting. Could be a pilot executing a mission profile that had nothing to do with any of those scenarios. At 2:54 a.m., the DAS resolved the contact's wing hardpoints at 9.2 nautical miles. Resolution at this range in the infrared channel. Sufficient for large store discrimination, insufficient for missile type identification.
The inboard pylons, thermal mass consistent with loaded stores. The midboard pylons, thermal mass consistent with loaded stores. The outboard pylons, cool, consistent with empty stations or ferry tanks. The contact was carrying 4 stores across 2 inboard and 2 midboard stations. The store's thermal signatures were consistent with the R-60 and R-73 infrared missiles that comprise the MiG-29's standard intercept loadout. Also consistent with drop tanks. Also consistent with training rounds, armed or tanks. The DAS could not determine which. The lead called the assessment at 2:54 a.m. and reported to the Hawkeye. Inboard and midboard stations loaded. Outboard clean, cannot discriminate ordnance type from current geometry. Continuing closure for visual identification. At 2:55 a.m., the first friction event in the engagement. The lead's NVG picture flickered as the contact passed through a layer of moisture at 13,400 feet, generating an ice crystal dispersal that briefly scattered the EOTS imaging channel's infrared energy. Duration, 6.1 seconds. The contact's track continuity was maintained by the APG-81's passive mode during the IR dropout. When the EOTS reacquired at 2:55 a.m. and 13 seconds, the contact was at 13,200 feet and closing, range 7.1 nautical miles. At 7.1 nautical miles, the DAS was producing resolution sufficient to read the aircraft's navigation light status. The contact's navigation lights were on. Left red, right green, tail white. Standard civil VFR navigation lights operating as they would on any aircraft broadcasting its presence to other traffic. The navigation lights of a military aircraft on a strike mission are off. The navigation lights of a military aircraft on a provocation sortie are usually off. The navigation lights of a pilot who wants to be seen are on. The pilot wanted to be seen. This detail arrived in the lead's tactical assessment like a piece that didn't fit the existing puzzle, but clearly belonged to a puzzle, just not the one the ROE card had prepared him for. A KPAF MiG-29 pilot, crossing the NLL with navigation lights on, radar off, descending slowly toward a naval contact altitude, on a heading that led to open water. The behavior was not consistent with any KPAF operational profile in the intelligence database. The intelligence database was comprehensive for KPAF standard operations. Standard operations were what the database described.
At 2:56 a.m., range 5.4 nautical miles, the lead requested updated authorization from the Hawkeye controller and from the Tactical Operations Center aboard USS America. The request was specific. The contact's behavior is consistent with a possible non-standard scenario. Request guidance on modified ROE for potential defection or emergency approach situation. The response from the Tactical Operations Center came in 43 seconds. Maintain observation, do not employ, contact ROK Air Force Liaison for NLL crossing notification, request identification attempt on guard frequency. Maintain safe separation, and continue reporting.
Guard frequency, 121.5 MHz. The international emergency frequency. The lead transmitted at 2:57 a.m. Unidentified MiG-29, bearing 015, altitude 13,000, heading 192. You have crossed the northern limit line into Republic of Korea airspace. This is a U.S. Navy aircraft intercepting you. Identify yourself and state your intentions. Transmit on guard frequency 121.5. Silence. The contact maintained heading 192. Speed 336 knots. Altitude 13,000 feet. No radio response. No change in flight profile. The navigation lights remained on. At 2:58 a.m., the lead closed to 3.1 nautical miles. Visual range. The DAS was now producing sufficient resolution to read the aircraft's fuselage number through the NVG overlay. 3 digits, painted white against the gray airframe. Not a standard KPAF production number format, The format matched a subset of MiG-29 airframes that intelligence had associated with the 55th Air Regiment based at Suwon Air Base. The specific three-digit combination did not appear in the resolved intelligence database as a known aircraft. That absence was not significant in either direction. The database was not complete for every current KPAF tail number. At 3.1 nautical miles in the DAS, the stores on the inboard and midboard pylons were now resolvable. The thermal and shape characteristics of the inboard stores are 73 infrared missiles. The thermal and shape characteristics of the midboard stores, drop tanks, external fuel tanks, not ordnance. The MiG-29 was carrying two R-73 missiles on its inboard pylons, its standard self-defense loadout for any operational flight, and two drop tanks indicating a planned extended range mission. Armed for self-defense, configured for range, not configured for a strike. The lead transmitted again on guard. Silence again. The contact maintained its heading and altitude with the steady indifference of a pilot, either unable to hear the guard frequency or choosing not to respond to it. At 3 a.m., something changed. The MiG-29's navigation lights blinked. Not a malfunction pattern, a deliberate sequence. 3 short flashes, a pause of approximately 2 seconds, 3 short flashes again. The international Morse signal for the letters SS. Not a standard aviation signal, not part of any published KPAF procedure, not in any U.S. Navy intercept protocol. 3 shorts, pause, 3 shorts. Repeated twice, then steady lights resumed. The lead held the DAS picture on the aircraft and transmitted the observation to the Hawkeye and the operations center simultaneously. Contact is flashing navigation lights in a deliberate 3-short pattern, repeating twice, then steady. Not a standard aviation signal. Assess as intentional communication attempt. Request guidance. The Tactical Operations Center's response took 61 seconds. 61 seconds during which the contact continued its steady southbound heading at 336 knots. The navigation lights now steady. The airframe holding its course with the patience of a pilot who had made a decision and was following it.
The response: maintain observation. Do not close inside 2 nautical miles without additional authorization. K Air Force has been notified. Emergency recovery procedures for unscheduled aircraft are being coordinated. Continue guard frequency attempts.
At 3:03 a.m., the second friction event in the engagement. The contact's N019 radar activated, briefly, for 4.1 seconds, in a mode the EW suite characterized as built-in test rather than operational search. A pilot running a pre-planned systems check on his avionics. Not a targeting lock, not a scan of the surrounding airspace. A self-test. The kind of self-test a pilot might run to verify that his communication and navigation systems were functional, or that had activated automatically as part of a system restart following a deliberate cold radio silence procedure. The radar went back to standby after 4.1 seconds. The contact continued south. At 3:06 a.m., 22 minutes since the NLL crossing, the contact's heading changed. A right turn, gentle, 10 degrees of bank, nose pulling west-southwest to heading 238. The new heading of 238 degrees did not lead toward USS America's position. It led toward the coastal waters off Incheon, where the ROK Joint Chiefs of Staff had an established emergency recovery corridor for exactly this type of scenario. The corridor had been in place since 1998. It had been used 3 times in that period, all for civilian aircraft emergencies. The contact was turning onto the emergency recovery corridor heading. The lead reported the heading change and requested final guidance on escort versus intercept posture. The operations center confirmed. Escort protocol, maintain safe separation, do not employ, coordinate handoff to ROK Air Force radar for recovery corridor management. At 3:07 a.m., the lead maneuvered to a position 1.5 nautical miles off the MiG-29's right wing, The standard escort position, the position from which the escorting aircraft is visible to the escorted pilot without creating a crossing geometry threat. In the DAS picture at 1.5 nautical miles, the MiG-29 pilot was visible through the canopy as a human silhouette in a helmet and oxygen mask, head forward, hands on the controls, flying his aircraft south with the focused posture of a pilot who had been flying for a long time and intended to keep flying for a specific distance more. The pilot did not look at the F-35B. He flew his aircraft. At 3:09 a.m., the ROK Air Force Radar Center at Osan took over primary management of the contact. The handoff from the Hawkeye took 47 seconds. The contact was now 34 nautical miles from the Incheon coast, descending through 9,000 feet on the recovery corridor heading, speed reduced to 280 knots. Normal approach profile. The ROK Air Force controller transmitted on guard. No response from the contact. The navigation lights remained on. The descent continued. At 3:14 a.m., the contact crossed the 12 nautical mile coastal boundary into South Korean territorial airspace proper. The ROK Air Force scrambled two KF-16S from Osan to join the escort at 3:09 a.m. The KF-16S reached visual range at 3:15 a.m. and fell into escort position on the MiG-29's left wing. 3 aircraft in formation, 2 Republic of Korea fighters and 1 U.S. Navy aircraft, escorting a North Korean MiG-29 through South Korean airspace toward an unscheduled landing. At 3:22 a.m., the MiG-29's undercarriage extended at 7.4 nautical miles from Suwon Air Base. The gear extension was the definitive signal that the pilot intended to land. The ROK Air Force controller cleared the emergency approach. The contact flew the ILS approach to runway 09 at Suwon with the steady precision of a pilot who had planned this approach in advance, touched down at 3:25 a.m., rolled out on the center line, and taxied off the active runway onto the ROK Air Force ramp where a security vehicle was already waiting. The F-35B broke off the escort at 3:22 a.m. when the gear extended. The lead turned south, climbing back toward the Marshall altitude, and transmitted the disengagement to the Hawkeye. Sentry, Falcon lead. Contact on final approach Suwon runway 09. Gear down. ROK Air Force has primary. Falcon lead, breaking off escort. Fuel state bingo +8. RTB. The debrief aboard USS America began at 4:30 a.m. and ran 2 hours and 20 minutes. The intelligence summary that framed the debrief was concise. The MiG-29 pilot was a KPAF officer who had been planning his departure for an undetermined period. His aircraft had been pre-positioned at Suncheon with full drop tanks. He had filed a training flight plan that covered the departure and initial routing as a standard low-level navigation exercise, reducing the window during which the KPAF's own tracking would assess his track as anomalous. He had crossed the NLL at cruise power with navigation lights on and radar off, which was the approach behavior least likely to trigger an aggressive response from an intercepting aircraft. He had used the 3 short light signal, not a military code, but a universal maritime distress signal that he had apparently assessed a trained pilot might recognize as intentional. He had turned onto the recovery corridor without prompting from any ground frequency, which meant he had researched the corridor's existence and heading before departure. The planning was detailed. The approach was precise. The navigation lights were on from the moment the contact appeared on the Hawkeye's radar. The decision to keep the radar off was a deliberate choice to look as non-threatening as possible to any intercepting aircraft's EW suite. The drop tanks were the tell that distinguished his configuration from a strike profile, 2 R-73s and 2 drop tanks on a MiG-29 is not an offensive loadout. It is a ferry configuration with self-defense missiles. Every detail of the pilot's behavior had been designed to communicate intent without radio. because he had assessed that any radio transmission on KPAF frequencies would be monitored and would trigger an alert before he reached the NLL, and any transmission on ROK or US frequencies would be detected and potentially misinterpreted as the opening of a communications profile that could be confused with a military electronic attack sequence.
He had been right on all counts. The debrief's operational finding was not about the contact's resolution. It was about the 22 minutes between the NLL crossing and the heading change onto the recovery corridor. For 22 minutes, a U.S. Navy F-35B had been escorting a KPAF MiG-29 carrying 2 live infrared missiles through South Korean airspace at night. Without radio contact, without transponder confirmation, without positive identification of intent. The ROE card had been clear about the threshold for employing ordnance. It had not been clear about what evidence level justified sustained close escort of an armed, non-communicating aircraft of unknown intent. The lead pilot's assessment, entered into the operational record, was 4 sentences. The navigation lights were on before I reached intercept range. The descent profile was not consistent with a strike. The store's configuration was not consistent with a strike. The heading change onto the recovery corridor occurred without prompting, which is not consistent with any hostile flight profile I have briefed against. The commanding officer noted the assessment, confirmed the decision as operationally sound, and recommended an update to the ROE card language for the non-communicating contact scenario. The recommendation was filed. The update was pending staffing at a level above the carrier. At Suwon Air Base, a MiG-29 with KPAF markings was parked on the ROK Air Force ramp with its drop tanks still attached and 2 R-73 missiles on its inboard pylons. The cockpit empty, the navigation lights off, the aircraft as quiet on the ground as it had been in the air for the 41 minutes it had taken to fly from North Hwanghae Province to a runway it had never landed on before. The pilot had known it would work. He had planned it carefully enough to be right. What he could not have known was how close the ROE geometry had been. How many seconds had elapsed between each indicator that pointed toward a non-hostile assessment and the closing range that would have forced a decision without those indicators. The 3 short light signal at 2:56 a.m. had arrived at the moment when the range was approaching the threshold at which the absence of a hostile act assessment would need to be replaced by a positive intent assessment to justify continued non-employment. The light signal had provided that assessment, not because the signal itself was definitive, because no hostile actor conducts a strike profile with navigation lights flashing a maritime distress signal. 1 MiG-29, 1 F-35B, 14,000 feet to 7,000 feet across the descent, 41 minutes from NLL crossing to wheels down at Suwon. 0 radio transmissions from the contact. 0 hostile acts confirmed. 0 ordnance employed. Intent confirmed, approximately 22 minutes after the crossing, by behavior rather than communication. The ROE card had held. The geometry had been closer than the mission report would convey. The Yellow Sea at 3:30 a.m. was dark and quiet. The carrier continued its transit. The Hawkeye continued its orbit. The NLL above was a line that an armed fighter had crossed in electronic silence 49 minutes earlier. The line was still where it had always been. The sky above it showed nothing. The radar tape showed everything. The 3 short light signal was on the DAS recording, frame by frame. Each flash a discrete infrared event logged with millisecond precision. The analysis team reviewing it 14 hours later would note that the interval between flashes was 0.31 seconds, consistent with a pilot counting silently in his head. Consistent with a man who had planned this moment in a country where planning this moment could not be done on paper or on a computer or in conversation with anyone else. Who had memorized the Morse code for distress because it was not in any KPAF flight manual he could access. Who had crossed a line at 2:44 a.m. and turned his lights on and waited.